afternoon at newstalk.ie. Our guest in the studio to kick things off is the CEO of Petrel Resources, David Horgan. David, good afternoon to you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for coming in to us today. What does Petrel Resources do?
We're explorers and developers, and particularly focused on oil and gas. And we have a group of companies with shareholders that back us in different parts of the world. But at the moment, we're actually exploring in the Irish offshore. And for the first time in a generation, the industry and the financial markets are getting excited again about Irish offshore exploration. You wouldn't know it from the atmosphere in Ireland, but in London now it's quite a hot story. And for the first time in 25 years, international independents and super majors are looking very seriously at the Irish Atlantic in particular. It's an international industry. You go where the oil and gas is, and sometimes the title is very secure, like in Ireland, and it's quite a pleasant and peaceful country. Other times it's nearly a war zone, or there's issues over title or over operational risk. It's actually in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that there are these fields of fire. Think of the story of Abraham and the burning bush. Almost certainly that was a gas seepage that was burning maybe for millions of years. Presumably, in Ireland, as you said, it's kind of relatively stable and straightforward, but presumably you have to operate in parts of the world where there are unsavoury regimes, let's put it that way. Yeah. That's a distinct skill set, I would imagine. Yeah, I mean, it's a very Irish question because you're assuming that most regimes are savoury. In fact, most regimes are unsavoury. If you look around the world, in Africa, there's a handful of honest countries. Even in Latin America, you have regimes that may decide in the morning to expropriate you. But it's a cycle. Countries tend to become more nationalistic, and then they find out that they don't get development, so they review and they liberalise and they get an economic boom. And then they get annoyed that the foreigners are making profits, and the cycle starts again. And if you look around the world, you see title problems everywhere. And where there aren't title problems, very often there are other problems. Like you saw how the burghers of Dalkey objected to even an exploratory well. Yeah, it's always an issue. You always bring baggage. Like if you look at the fiasco above in Corrib, Shell never anticipated when they bought the company, they bought their enterprise, that 20 years on, they would be waiting to bring that gas into production. So there's always potential to screw things up if you really try to, if you're negligent about it. Yeah. On the other hand, it's not that difficult to get things right. And everywhere in the world there are sensitivities. Like we've operated in the jungles of Peru, the same place that Roger Casement operated. We've operated in Africa and the Middle East. We've never had a significant problem with the local community. There's always troublemakers. Like in Peru, we had a problem with a left-wing Colombian priest, and he wouldn't even negotiate with us. And that was a real difficulty until we identified a convent of nuns in the community. And the nuns were very practical ladies, and they had specific requests, things like school books and spending on a schoolhouse. And we cut a deal with the nuns, did the work that they wanted, gave them the books that they wanted, and they sorted the priest out. So there's always a solution if you're imaginative. Well, I think the nuns, I don't think they were left wing or right wing. I think they were just concerned at the betterment of the people for which they were working. You know, the kids may look healthy when you see them playing in the river, but you're looking at the half that survived. So what we did there was we made a pitch to the progressive voices in that community. It was the nuns, and we got them on our side, and we were able to conduct our work without problems. The resource is there and can only be used once, and once oil is burnt, it's burnt forever. It's not like diamonds or gold, which are recycled eternally. However, the supply that is available is very sensitive to the technology that we have and to the price of oil. And the average price of oil for the last 40 years has been about $24 a barrel. Now it's over $100 a barrel.
If oil is found on my land, who owns it, me or the state? Donald wants to know.
The state.
So you get, like if there's oil in your back garden.
If the operator has any brains at all, and some of them don't, he'll make it worth the landowner's while, because the value of the project is very great compared to the cost of making locals happy, and the cost of any delay, as Shell found, is horrendous. Even though Shell has a low cost of capital, about 7%, basically they've added probably at least 800 million to their capital cost because of the delays. Now, a few million thrown around the local GAA and the local charities would have saved them a vast amount of money.
But if oil is found on a farmer's land, for instance, the farmer can say, well, you just can't drill on my land. They can prevent it that way, can't they not?
In Ireland, you can take a pitchfork to people, and that's happened to some of our companies. But under law, it's the minister's entitlement to grant a licence, and the farmer has to, like the ESB or Bord Gáis or anyone else, the farmer has to cooperate. And if you're reasonably generous, you can solve most human problems. Can you ask David if any of the resources his company find will be nationalised, unlike the resources off our west coast, which could have saved our banjaxed economy?
I don't think it will be nationalised in Ireland. And if you look at the recent ministers of all parties, including the current minister, Pat Rabbitte, they've been very well briefed by their department and very pro-exploration. Elsewhere in the world, yes, I mean, what happened in Bolivia was effectively a nationalisation in that the state took the oil and gas that we had in the ground and it took ownership of it. We still have the right to produce it, but at much higher tax rates.
Talking about nationalising, obviously there's a kind of reference, and a big reference to what's happened with Shell in Rossport. In your view, what did Shell do wrong?
Shell bought a company called Enterprise, which had a great guy, a Scot, who's allegedly a Rangers supporter who managed to put the backs up of all the locals. Mayo was a special place. I mean, this is wholly an Irish history in that this is Michael Dwyer's land. And because of the tragedy of the famine and mass immigration, to put it tactfully, the title of many turf banks and farmland is somewhat uncertain, in that maybe the true technical owner of some of those turf banks is residing in Springfield, Massachusetts or Glasgow. That makes the locals extremely sensitive when foreigners come sniffing around their property. And there was no tradition of industry in the area, so by stomping around with big boots, they managed to upset a minority of very vocal people, and once you have people prepared to go on hunger strike for a principle, you've lost, and you've probably lost permanently. You compare that with the experience down in Kinsale, where people used the port of Cove, the old Royal Navy port, for 40 years without the slightest difficulty. That shows what can be achieved in Ireland. There's no reason why the Corrib fiasco had to happen, and it shouldn't happen again.
Is it fixable now, do you think, or are they just permanently
Not really. I mean, they've had this 20-year delay, and the horrendous capital cost increment can't be reversed. But it will come into production in the next couple of years. But it's left a very bad smell in the nostrils of Shell and Statoil, their partner in particular, and has been a problem. One of the reasons why there's been so little drilling in the Irish offshore in the last 20 years.
Really, because of that?
Yeah, because what happens is that boards tend to look at the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and if there's a headline saying a hunger strike against Shell in Ireland, they don't read beyond that. You know, there's 220 countries in the world that they can lose their money in. They don't have to come to Ireland. So it takes a lot of effort to explain to people that, you know, the Porcupine Basin has huge potential. It's 20 to 100 kilometres offshore. There isn't the same difficulties in other parts of Ireland that there is in Mayo. And that's a difficult job that, you know, the O'Reilly family and others have been working on for decades. But it has postponed the development of oil and gas in Ireland and other industries too. I think the damage goes beyond oil and gas.
Now, where is Petrel Resources looking in Ireland specifically?
In the Porcupine Basin. Basically, we have two licence options. One right beside where this well at Dunquin is going down in Quadrant 45. The other one beside the old BP discovery called Connemara, though obviously it's not onshore, in the north of the Porcupine Basin. I mean, the numbers are very interesting. Ireland has only ever had 215 wells drilled in 40 years, which is practically nothing in offshore waters that are 250,000 square kilometres. And of those, about 54 have been drilled in the Atlantic. So nearly all that have been drilled either onshore or in the Celtic Sea. And only 30 drilled in the Porcupine, of which the last real wildcat was drilled in the 80s. So really the modern technology that we discussed has never been applied in the Irish offshore. And you know, they say that exploration begins again every 10 years. So really the opening of Irish exploration again is coming at a very exciting time, and I think there will be major discoveries.
If you discover oil, once you've deducted the cost of the exploration, how much does the Irish state get?
Irish fiscal terms are very favourable. Basically,
okay.
But because the general rules apply, basically every loss that you've made in the same trade, as long as you've accounted for it properly, goes back to the year dot, to Adam and Eve if they were exploring for oil and gas. So in the case of Providence, for example, if they've done their accounting correctly, they should be able to go back all the way back to Atlantic Resources, which was set up in the early 80s. That means that you can write off all the historic expenditure against tax. Now, in their case, they've probably spent $1 billion, so there'll be a lot of write-offs before they have to pay any tax. Now, if there are major discoveries, you can be sure that the Irish Exchequer will be looking again at these rules. We don't expect that Ireland is the sort of country that will actually default on its promises or breach its word. That's not going to happen. Ireland is too respectable a country for that. So the great bulk of it will be available under new rules, and the state will be looking very carefully at what happens in the next year or two. And if there are major discoveries, and we all hope there are, you can be sure that the Irish Exchequer will get its snout in the trough.
That means that you won't pay any tax if you find oil, but the next person who comes along when they've heard you has found oil will probably pay some tax.
Now that's actually very good, because if you look at, say, in England or Scotland, basically you can only write off your losses on the block itself in 3 contiguous blocks, and they're relatively small in the North Sea. So let's say BP has a well off of Rockall on the Scottish side of the line, which is a dud. They can't write that off against their production in the North Sea. So the Irish terms are actually quite favourable, which they are for most corporations. It's part of Irish industrial policy.
You've got a CEO of an oil company to talk about oil. What's the point of that? Certainly not an objective discussion. I'm pretty sure he'll drill in Machu Picchu if there was a bit of oil underneath it. Buying books in exchange for oil, that's a fair deal. Please, a joke.
Well, actually,
you do work in an industry where a lot of people just think you're evil, that you're participating in destroying the environment.
And there's a historic reason for that, because if you look back to the origins of the industry, like these were like Irish property developers in recent years. They were gung-ho, they dreamed the dream, and they did incredible things. Like, if people say the easy oil is gone, but the easy oil has always been gone. The first well was drilled about 150 years ago in Pennsylvania, and it was 150 feet, and it was a gusher. A few decades later, Irish lads down in East Texas had a stock market scam. They drilled on a bump in the ground, because that was the easiest place to drill. They had a huge gusher. They started firing their 6 guns into the gas cloud. It could have ignited. The industry is full of these guys who just bend the rules. Like, for example, you talked about fracking. Fracking was developed by Irish-American guys who, in World War II, were trying to maximize production for the war effort, and found that they couldn't buy a pump that had the right pressures. So what do? They ignored health and safety. They went off into a garage and they tried to build their own pumps, which naturally enough exploded several times. No one was killed. But now they're selling these pumps to top German companies like Siemens. So the history of the industry has always been to take risk. And if you get it right, you make a fortune. A lot of the time you don't.
David, thanks very much for coming in to us today. That was David Horgan there, CEO of Petrel Resources. We'll be back with the news.